good morning. I'm Emilie Hafner-Burton. I've come from the University of California, San Diego, where it's currently 1 o'clock in the morning, so that's the time zone that I'm on right now, so please bear with me in this process. I really want to thank the Freedom Rights Project for organizing what I think is a very important conference and a very important discussion, and thanks to all of you for taking the time to be here. I think this is going to be a stimulating conversation. My role today is going to be a little bit different than some of the other people who is going to be speaking with you, because what I want to do is talk with you about the big picture behind the system and what we're learning about it from the perspective of those of us who do research with big data. And I'll explain to you what I mean by that in more detail. But we're learning an awful lot from data about what the system in its various manifestations can actually do, its strengths and its weaknesses. So of course, over the past 60-some years, we've created this very dense system, right, by which we mean this collection of all of these different tools to promote human rights. And we have states that are making commitments to a large and growing number of treaties and institutions. The number of rights that we are codifying has grown over time. We see advocates operating all over the world. We have criminal courts prosecuting in various jurisdictions. All of this is very exciting. The system that we're talking about today is very diverse in its parts and very diverse in its approaches. And my view is that it does really articulate a very powerful vision for the promotion and the protection of human rights, and that it has fundamentally changed the way we talk and the way we think about human rights in some very important ways, and that it has achieved some tremendous success. But we face a very fundamental challenge, and it's what I really want to speak with you about today, which is that human rights abuses continue to persist in so many parts of the world, despite the growing number of institutions and the growing number of laws and the growing membership and participation in these institutions and the growing number of advocates and mechanisms, right? We see more and more and more efforts to try and promote human rights, and we see abuses persist in very, very pernicious ways. Our legal institutions have possibilities, but they alone are very limited in what they can achieve. Many of the states that were once thought to be leaders for the human rights movement are increasingly accused of hypocrisy, rightly or wrongly. Right? And we have to face facts that many of the emerging economies and emerging powers in the world right now are on the fence about human rights in the way we're talking about them. And some of them, frankly, are altogether resistant. So these are real challenges for us and for any system that really sees international consensus as the basis for spreading the concept of human rights. Meeting these challenges is going to require a lot of things. One of the things it's going to require is self-assessment, and that's what I want to talk about today. Are our current strategies working? Are the laws that we have on the books, are they actually changing behavior? Not just human rights talk, we know they're changing human rights talk, but are they actually changing the way governments and other actors behave with regards to human rights? Are protections increasing? Are our advocacy and our foreign policy strategies working to do what we want them to do? So I want to talk to you about a little bit about what we're learning about some of these questions in the context of big data. So probably everybody in this room can think about examples of success and failure in the system, and there are plenty of examples of both, right? And those are important. We should be talking about those examples. But examples can also be very misleading, because what might work in one place, in one particular location, in one particular time, does not necessarily translate into policy that will work in another place, in another case, in another time. So alongside these examples, which are important, we need to start putting the examples together and looking for patterns in terms of behavior, patterns across countries, patterns across time, patterns across different types of strategies. And I'm a member of a research community that's essentially trained to do this, to look for large-scale patterns. And we're learning that there are many accomplishments from this system, but that there are also a variety of big challenges. And I want to speak with you today about 4 challenges in particular. One of them is awareness. So the human rights system that we have created, it requires participation, along with some sense of legitimacy to the system for it to function effectively. That's absolutely crucial. But what we are learning is that the vast majority of the world is absolutely unaware of their rights or their recourse. Right? This is especially true for the victims that this system is designed to protect. Now, there are a lot of reasons for this. Part of the problem is education, literacy. Part of the problem is censorship by governments. But another part of the problem that we've been focusing on recently is that human rights is by and large in this day an elite concept. When you look around the world, they are not part of the average lives of average daily citizens, right? They're not part of the discourse of many human rights victims. So I can give you just a few examples from the data. In Mexico today, new survey research, quite interesting, shows you that elites are more than twice as likely as the general population to have ever even heard about the term of human rights. And there's only 4% of the population in Mexico which participates in any kind of organized human rights activity. That is really low for a country that has massive human rights problems, right? In India, it's 1 out of 5 people who live in and around the major financial centers have ever even heard of the term human rights in Hindi. Okay? This is not just a problem of Mexico and India. In the United States, our best estimates suggest that 90% of the people have never heard of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Okay? We have a PR problem, is what I'm suggesting to you. Right? The people who are most likely to be familiar with the human rights legal system, right, what's going on in Geneva and in the regions, these are young urban lawyers, and academics and NGO staffers. It's you in this room. It's not very many others. And when people do know about the system, what we've learned is that not all human rights command the same or equal attention. So the knowledge that we have of this system is partial and it's highly restricted. This is a problem, right? Because if people do not know about their human rights, if they do not know that there is an advocacy system in place to help them, if they do not know how to access that system, they cannot use it themselves to demand greater attention and redress. Right? So we need to make deeper inroads into the main constituency of this system who are in fact not being treated at full, which are the people who are afflicted. So we face a challenge then, which we can perhaps discuss together, which is about how do we spread information to the right populations about this system. And it's not immediately obvious how to address this challenge because it may not just be a matter of getting the word out. In fact, the system has been pretty good at doing that. It's made a lot of reforms in recent past. It's translated the Universal Declaration into hundreds of languages, put it up on the website. It's not that information isn't physically out there. There are some other things that are getting in the way, and I'll speak about a few. The first, of course, is that not every universal human rights value is universally accepted or interpreted in the same way into different local customs and practices. Some of our key cornerstone laws in this system sometimes conflict with local culture and religious traditions. And in a variety of communities, we are finding that human rights actually has a quite negative connotation amongst the general population. So you'll find places in Israel, for example, highly educated community, people are absolutely aware of the terminology of human rights. Vastly more than half of the population connotates a negative term when you use the term human rights because it's thought of as a euphemism in that case for Palestinian rights. Israel is certainly not alone on that issue. So the data are also suggesting something quite interesting, which is that not all people have the same perception of how serious human rights problems actually are. Right? People interpret these problems differently, and those patterns turn out to be somewhat predictable. So a huge study done recently measuring people's perceptions about human rights across 55 different countries in the world. And what they found was quite interesting, which is that it's the rich, educated, elderly men tend to look at a human rights situation and don't see it as particularly grave. Where the exact same situation, when you ask women, younger folks, and the less educated, will interpret that situation to be a much more serious problem for human rights. What's important about that is that how people evaluate a human rights situation, which is at the essence of what we do in this system, depends both on the context of the situation, but it also appears to depend on who you are in coming to that situation. So the challenge for us is really not only in how we're going to spread information, but it's spreading it in the right ways to create uptake in the communities that we believe it matters most. And I think there are a host of possible solutions to this challenge, but one that we should begin to discuss. A second, and I think related challenge for us is bias in information. One of the key tools of our system is shaming, right? That's really what our system was designed to do, publicly identifying violations and condemning the perpetrators in public space for doing so, right? So the generation of this information, these reported facts, is essential to the functioning of the system, to uncover abuses, to mobilize public opinion, to motivate governments and advocates to intervene on behalf of victims, right? Information is the key enforcement mechanism that we have in this system. But our system is not neutral and it is not objective in how it spreads information. Okay? It exhibits systematic patterns in terms of who gets outed for what type of violation under what circumstance. So this is important for us to talk about for a few minutes. So let me start with legal institutions. The research community has recently analyzed the entire history of public shaming done by the United Nations. Several of the arms from the General Assembly, the Council, previously the Commission, various treaty bodies, all the way back into time. And it shows a variety of really interesting patterns that have emerged about who's getting shamed and under what circumstances. And you can see clear patterns that the United Nations has a track record of favoritism in certain conditions. So countries, for example, that participate in peacekeeping missions are much less likely to get criticized by United Nations human rights machinery, even when they do really nasty, terrible things, compared to their counterparts who are not participating in peacekeeping. Same is true for powerful countries, by the way. We can also find patterns to compensation for victims in the treaty bodies, right? So when you look at the whole history of the Human Rights Committee, for example, you can see that the committee has been much more favorable to the claims of certain types of victims over others, right? More favorable to claims relating to due process and civil liberties, less so relating to the rights of women and the rights of children. I don't know why. The big data don't tell me the answer to why that's happening, but those patterns are clearly there. And these findings of favoritism are not just unique to the United Nations. We can find evidence of them in a lot of the different parts of our system, including our courts, by the way, which is quite interesting. I'll just give you one example here. European Court of Human Rights, we often think of that as the crown jewel. It's one of the most important parts of our human rights system. We can see here that the judicial philosophy of the judges that sit on this court are systematically linked to the political ideologies of the governments that appoint them. So left-wing governments tend to appoint judges that are more activist, and those judges tend to rule in very different ways than others. Judges are much more likely to rule in favor of their own country. We can also find that judges who are either close to retirement or who have diplomatic backgrounds are also much more likely to rule in favor of their own country in disputes. So the point here is really that who sits in these positions really does seem to matter in terms of how these institutions function and how they rule on different decisions, on what types of information they produce in the system. And these patterns, by the way, extend into advocacy organizations and the media, too. So I'm going to talk about this for just a minute because it's quite important. These are essential players, if not the most essential players in our system of enforcement, right, where we enforce law through the production and dissemination of information. So we have studies that have gone back and looked at some prominent NGOs, for example, Amnesty International. Every single report they've ever written, every single shaming issue they've ever put into the public space for every country in the world. And other reports have done this for major Western media outlets. And here again, we see really interesting patterns. We are not always shaming those who most deserve it based on their human rights behavior. And that may actually be okay. I'm going to come back to that point in just a moment. But we should nonetheless be very aware that our organizations are systematically over-reporting on some cases and under-reporting on other cases. And there are lots of places with repression and conflict that we are not spending a lot of time publicly shaming, and there are lots of places with lower tier levels of repression that are getting a lot of attention, okay? We need to be aware of the biases into this process. Now, to complicate matters even more, we need the mainstream media to play a role here. That's part of what advocacy does, is to produce information, and then you need the media to disseminate that information. But of course, the media is picking up on these advocates' reports in very uneven ways. So just a couple of facts that you might find interesting. They are not likely to disseminate shaming reports produced by non-governmental organizations when repression is taking place in certain types of countries, like the big poor ones. The media tend to, which is quite odd, you think it would be the opposite, underreport on the autocrats. And they're oftentimes also underreporting on some of the most severe human rights crises. They tend to report more on certain regions and less on other regions. There's all kinds of biases built into this process. So a key challenge then is that the success of advocates' efforts to reinforce this system through the dissemination of information is highly dependent on uptake by institutions that are operating with incentives other than the promotion and protection of human rights. Okay? So these patterns, whether they are conscious or unconscious, they're systematic, and they're a problem for us or a challenge for us to the extent that what they do is skew the accountability process at the center of the system in ways that we may not intend and in ways that could potentially be counterproductive. And here too, I think there are a variety of different strategies to at least identify, if not eliminate, these biases and to work around them. Okay, another area where data are making some inroads is with regards to the effectiveness of the international legal system, so the conversation we were just speaking of. And by effectiveness here, I simply mean whether or not we are finding that after states participate in this system, ratify laws, et cetera, we see a change for the better in their actual human rights practices. That's what I mean. And here there's really good news, which is that when we look to history and we compare the experiences of every single country out there for the past 30 years and their involvement in this system, we find that certain types of countries, specifically Denmark, right, the most advanced democratic countries out there, are really pretty good at making these legal commitments and following through. There are absolutely some exceptions. I live in a country that I would call an exception right now. But this should come as no surprise, given that these are the countries that have been, in many cases, driving the formation of these laws and that already have the domestic political conditions in place that are necessary to protect human rights. We really don't know, to the point made earlier, whether this is cause or effect, or whether these countries, these treaties are actually doing anything in these places, or whether we're just codifying the status quo. It's probably some of both. More promising is also the finding that these legal commitments are followed by growing protections for human rights in places like Chile, in places that have suffered a history of mass atrocity of various kinds and that have a newfound commitment to the consolidation of democratic institutions and the growth of civil society at home. And in those places, we find evidence that they're more likely, after they participate in the system, to do things like grant rights to freer religious practices, to provide educational opportunities to girls, to reduce instances of torture. So the law does appear to have some pull in these locations, and that's very important. But it doesn't always work that way, and I want to talk about the other side of the coin here, which is that we are clearly seeing that the domestic conditions for uptake have to be in place in order for international law to gain much traction. Our system works best through domestic civil society and local institutions, sometimes in partnership with other states and other international organizations. But without these advocates and institutions in place domestically, enforcement of the legal system is extremely rare and remedies are largely ineffective. And this is very important for us because it narrows the scope for where we can expect this system to have an impact. And I'm going to return to that in just a minute. But it also explains where we see another troubling pattern in the data, which is that commitments to the legal system do not generally relate well to protections for human rights in the places where people are most in jeopardy. Okay? So what we want to see in a perfect world is that states participate in the system, they ratify treaties, they write the reports, and that human rights get better over time, right? We want to see a change in the actual behavior. Maybe not right away, maybe in 10 years down the road, maybe 20 years. We don't know what the right time frame is. It's a process, I think we all agree, but we want to see some evidence of change. So the problem is that that is not the pattern that the big data are finding for us, and I'll simply give you one example. International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. This is a treaty that you're all familiar with. It's one of the cornerstones of the International Bill of Human Rights. Right? States parties who have pledged to this treaty have made promises to protect some of our most fundamental rights, rights to self-determination. right? Liberty and the security of the person, rights to give victims an effective remedy. We've got almost 170 states in the world that have made a commitment to this treaty. Denmark, North Korea, right? spans the gamut. But when we look to history, do we see a noticeable change in behavior? Do we actually see a reduction in murder and torture in these places? Do we see a rise in political rights and civil liberties? And the answer is yes, we do, but only in a very small subset of cases. The vast majority of states keep acting the same way they did before they ever became members of this system. And they do not change, and this doesn't change over time. Even a decade, 2 decades after the fact, we can't find evidence of sort of large-scale systematic change. About 75% of the case. So this is a challenge for us, and we have to think carefully about why. Now, another pattern that we see, which is tremendously worrying, is that there are certain countries that are making commitments to certain treaties where we see systematically they get worse after they join onto the treaty. And we can't make this go away. We find the pattern over and over and over again. I'll give you one example here. Convention Against Torture. We can show you that when we look at the historical data, every country that's ever ratified in history, the likelihood that you torture increases after you become a member of this convention. It's something odd is going on here. Now, the data tell us that this pattern exists, but they don't explain to us why, and we're still debating over what might be going on here, and there's a whole bunch of different possibilities. Maybe these legal commitments are allowing leaders to do even more terrible things than they would do without the treaty, so somehow they're providing shields to autocrats. Maybe these legal commitments are actually inspiring people on the ground to fight for their rights openly now that there is a treaty in place. And what's happening is that sort of level of dissent is simply causing more repression, right? So it's a sort of positive, hopefully short-term uptick. Maybe these commitments are just getting made precisely at the time when states are kind of spiraling into a problem and they sign on to the treaty for various reasons, and so it's just coincidence. There are a variety of different explanations. Whatever the reasons, though, the big data paint a pretty mixed picture about the capacity of this system to improve human rights, and a worrying picture about the capacity to improve rights, especially in those areas where people are most vulnerable. And that's worrying. So these findings give me pause to reflect a little bit on why the system we built does not have a truly global impact, why we are not doing a very good job at serving what I think of as our core constituency, and whether there's anything we really can do or should do to change that. Problem, from my perspective, is not lack of participation by states, because there really is no region or culture in the world that is not in some voluntary way participating in this system. And as we've discussed, many states with frankly just terrible human rights records are participating in some of the privileged positions in this system, sitting on the Human Rights Council today: Algeria, Pakistan, Russia, Sierra Leone. Given the current track record, it's not clear to me that getting more states to sign up for more of these legal commitments is going to do much more to help us at this stage. I think we kind of have done what we can do because of this high formal participation rate. It may be possible to improve the quality of participation, and I think we can talk a little bit about that, but it is not at all clear that getting autocrats and despots to write better self-reports is going to change anything until the domestic politics in those locations actually change. I've just written a book, which I'll have an advertisement, if I may, for you, called Making Human Rights a Reality. In that book, I talk through a variety of possible reforms to this system, and I do believe there are a variety of things that can be done to improve the quality of this system, including spreading awareness of the laws, and including reforming some of the really cumbersome bureaucracy, which is simply getting in the way of the proper functioning of this system. I won't go into those now, but I would invite you to look at the book if you find that interesting. But I do want to make a key point here, which is that no matter how we design these laws, we have an insurmountable challenge in front of us, and that is state sovereignty, right? The system has the most effect in places with well-established civil societies, established or nascent human rights stakeholders, and functioning local governmental institutions. And elsewhere, right, you can tinker with the system all you want, and it's very unlikely that it's going to have a large and substantial effect on those places. It is very hard to do this from the outside, and this explains why we have the situation in North Korea. No part of the international human rights system is going to change that problem. Our system, by design, lacks central authority, right? Our international treaty bodies are empowered to oversee the reporting process and the complaints procedures, but of course they have no way to actually enforce that governments implement them. And this is also, of course, true for our courts. At the end of the day, it is governments that decide whether and when and how to engage with the system and whether and when and how to actually implement any of its objectives. And they do it when it is in their interest, and when it is not in their interest, they do not do it. So the way to get change is to make this in government's interests, right? And is to manipulate their incentives. The message here is only as effective as the messenger to be seen as legitimate, and also that there will be real consequences for breaking these laws. And here we face some challenges on both fronts, challenges which I do not believe are insurmountable, but which are challenges nonetheless. In the eyes of many perpetrators and some victims, the system is not a legitimate advocate, and we need to work on solving that problem. And we have to remember that the primary consequences for lawbreaking do not stem from the legal system itself. Right? They come outside the state, from local or transnational stakeholders who are the ones who then place pressures on governments to make change. And that is where legal remedies can help in tandem, and this is where we should focus. Okay, last point I want to make very briefly is that the universality of human rights norms, which is really the bedrock of our system, is not a tenable guide for implementation. Right? We have to separate those two concepts. The resources needed to protect human rights, of course, are quite scarce. Constraints in all phases of the system require us to make choices. And we need a framework for making these choices to greater effect. We either need to fix or prune the parts of our system that are not helping, and we need to focus our resources on the places where they can get the most traction. I've already suggested to you that we have patterns of bias in our system. We're not giving equal attention or remedy to all cases. And that bias is actually necessary in this process. So the question for us, in my mind, is not whether we need bias, but whether the current biases in place are the ones that we want to be operating under, whether those are the biases, or whether there is another set of criteria on which we should make decisions about how we set our priorities. And I want to conclude by suggesting that we could benefit from a more calculated bias than the one we have today, a conscious determination about what types of situations get priorities and how. So this is a somewhat discomforting conversation because it does require choices that are ethically challenging and also quite contrary to the core principles of universality and indivisibility. But I think it's an important conversation because it is impossible to treat human rights as universal and indivisible in our efforts to promote them. So on what basis should we be making these choices? One possible framework is that where we can, we act a little bit more like doctors in the medical community, right? And we triage. We put systems in place that help us to operate when the demand for treatment outstrips the supply of what we have to offer. And we think about some of the challenges that we face. They're not that different or not that dissimilar from the triage situation. Right? We operate with limited resources. We have an array of tools. We have to face a decision how to allocate our resources when not every issue can get attention. And we can set priorities more on the likely consequences that the policies will work, which is not currently how we devise most of our human rights policy, and less on hope that a policy will work, policy inertia, which drives an awful lot of what we do, public outcry, which also drives a lot of what we do, and these unconscious biases. So we can start prioritizing based on some knowledge of what will likely work. To do this, however, we need to build assessments about what might work. There's no laundry list that tells us what will work and what won't. And this is where the turn to big data is really quite interesting because it can start to help in collaboration with all the other efforts that's going on to produce more sophisticated analyses and predictions about what types of policies are most likely to work in what types of situations. So I really think there's a way forward here. So let me just conclude by saying that I believe that we need to carefully evaluate and possibly rethink our current approach to human rights promotion, because there is a tension between really valuable aspirational norms that seek to cover every person and every right, and just the practical day-to-day politics of decision-making that oftentimes require hierarchy and partiality to do this job. And we need to come to terms with that tension. And we can do that by building the knowledge about which parts of the system are likely to work and invest our resources there to identify the probable failures and create strategies to fix them or steer clear of them. We could do more of that. And in doing so, I think we need to embrace a larger role for power and partiality in the service of the law, because much of the effort that actually advances human rights comes from particular countries. So in essence, I'm suggesting that we need more pragmatism. Thank you.
We have time for one question. Who wants to ask it? Okay, I saw your hand first. And
somebody else, since I'm speaking late and I'm happy to.
who is the someone else? Okay, you're it, sir. Can you identify yourself?
My name is Hans-Otto. I come from the Danish Institute for Human Rights. Sorry. Hans-Otto, Danish Institute for Human Rights. So I want to thank Emilie Hafner-Burton for this insightful and very thought-provoking presentation. I have two questions. One is okay. That's okay.
We can have a coffee after, and you can ask me the second.
No, but what your analysis and also what you have written earlier is pointing to is the importance of civil society, and what I heard you say today is also the importance of local civil society. And that means that legitimacy of the Human Rights Project locally becomes pretty crucial. The way to mobilize local actors is also a way to, on the road to ensuring human rights success. And that means probably that we have to work on both sets of rights, isn't it? You have to work on both political rights and social rights, because otherwise you may tend to jeopardize legitimacy locally. Thank you. I wanted to ask you about data, but...
We can talk about data at the coffee break. Thank you very much. I'll simply be very brief to say that I couldn't agree more. And in one of the chapters of the book that I just wrote, it is precisely this discussion that I believe we need to be having, because this was really a conversation geared more towards foreign policy and what states can do to be more effective. But even local human rights, even transnational human rights organizations have begun to realize that they need to have much greater buy-in from local stakeholders, or the mission fails. So that's what Amnesty International is out doing right now. Human Rights Watch has a different model. But it's absolutely essential to build local credibility. Otherwise, these policies backfire or they get no traction. And it is a huge problem with the way how much of foreign policy has been oriented from the top down rather than woven through the local fabric of society. And it's why you find in so many locations not only animosity for the messenger, but animosity of the message, where you have people who have negative connotations to the term human rights. And I think these things can be really ameliorated precisely through that process. We'll talk about data at coffee. Thank you for your question.